All right, picture this. Hundreds of these stone spheres, some like bigger than a car,
Yeah.
perfectly shaped, just scattered across this landscape. If you were the investigator, stepping onto the scene for the first time, where would you even start? What kind of questions pop into your head when you see these mysterious stone spheres of Costa Rica? That's what we're going to dive into today.
It's a case, that's captivated people for decades. And for this deep dive, we've got a bunch of clues lined up, news articles, from back in the day and more recent ones, plus a really thorough Wikipedia entry that kind of sums up a lot of the research so far. Each piece helps us get closer to cracking this archaeological code.
So our investigation, it all begins back in the 1930s in this lush region called the Tequis Delta. Picture this, a banana company just clearing land, and boom, they stumble upon this bizarre object. And what started as just a few weird finds, well, it quickly turned into over 300 of these spheres being unearthed. Can you imagine that? Some small enough to hold in your hand, others absolutely massive, over 8 feet across, some even weighing as much as like a fully loaded truck.
Right.
I mean, what would you make of that?
The sheer scale of this discovery, it just throws up so many questions, right? Like, who had the skills and the resources to pull this off? What kind of methods did they use? And the big one, of course, what were these things even for? Well, our mission today is to really dig into the facts, explore all the theories out there and try to piece together the most likely story, just like you would, if you were right there on the scene collecting evidence.
So it wasn't exactly a picture-perfect archaeological dig, was it? It sounds like the way they were found kind of mess with our ability to really understand them.
Yeah, for sure. The main sites are all clustered in the Tequis Delta, especially around Palmar Sur, Finca 6, Grijalba 2, El Silencio, Batambal. Those names are key for our mental map here. Finca 6 is particularly important because that's where they found the first ones back in '39, right in the middle of this mad rush to clear land for bananas.
And that rush, sadly, led to some pretty damaging consequences. It wasn't that careful, documented excavation you'd want with something this unique.
It's a real shame, yeah. A lot of the early reaction was driven by local folklore, this idea that the spheres were hiding gold. You can just imagine the chaos, right? This belief fueled so much looting and even worse, they destroyed some of them, blowing them up with dynamite to get to the non-existent treasure. What a blow for our investigation,
Dynamite. That just seems, I don't know, almost violent, using that on these ancient objects. It's hard to wrap your head around the damage, the loss of potential clues. That's a major setback for anyone trying to piece together the original context.
It's a huge loss, definitely. But thankfully, it's not the end of the story. The National Museum of Costa Rica, they recognize the cultural and historical importance of these spheres, and they stepped in to try and save what was left. Over the years, they've done amazing work recovering, restoring, and preserving them, getting them back to their original spots whenever possible. It's a ray of hope for our investigation, for sure.
So despite that initial destruction, there was this real effort to preserve what was left and learn from it.
Absolutely. And a really cool development that helps us, almost travel back in time is the park they opened at Finca 6. It lets visitors and us in our investigation see the spheres laid out the way they were originally. It gives you a much better sense of how they might have been used and the layout of these settlements. Plus, they've got a museum there now, providing crucial context about the spheres and the people who made them. Essential info for our analysis.
So you can actually walk among them, just as they were all those years ago. That's got to be a powerful experience. Okay, let's zoom in on the evidence itself, the spheres themselves. What do we know about the materials, and how in the world did they even make these shapes?
Well, like we've talked about, the size difference is crazy, right? Some fit in your hand, some are absolutely gigantic. The main material, as our sources tell us, is gabbro. It's kind of like basalt, that dark volcanic rock. But gabbro forms deeper underground, so it's got this slightly different, more grainy texture. Key takeaway. It's incredibly hard. Oh, and it's worth noting that some were made from other stuff too, like limestone, the kind with shells in it, and sandstone. But gabbro, that's the most common one by far.
Gabbro, super hard. Just think about trying to shape that with, basic tools. So what's the main theory about how they actually did it?
The leading idea, and there's a lot of archaeological evidence to back it up, like finding stone tools near the spheres, is that it was a super labor-intensive process. They probably started with these natural boulders and used other rocks as hammers, basically chipping away at them, slowly shaping them. Then, to get those smooth surfaces, they probably used sand or maybe other abrasive materials, grinding and polishing for like ages. Just imagine the time, the effort, all those people working on a single sphere.
Hammering and polishing with sand
Mm.
for something the size of a small car. That's
Mhm.
wild. It really shows how dedicated they were and how organized they must have been.
It really highlights the level of organization, right, and the commitment they had to this shared vision. Now, there's a myth that pops up a lot that we should address. The idea that every single sphere is perfectly round, while some are amazingly spherical, like getting close to 96% perfect, others are, a bit more wonky.
So it's not like this machine made perfection across the board.
Exactly. The claims of absolute perfection, they often come from how they measured the spheres back in the day. Samuel Lothrop, he was a key researcher early on, and he took detailed measurements. But the tools back then just weren't precise enough to really say for sure. So yeah, a lot of them are remarkably round, but it's not a universal thing. Important to remember.
Yeah, it makes sense. Humans, even with all the skill in the world, probably couldn't achieve that level of, like, mathematical perfection on that scale. Okay, the million-dollar question.
Hmm.
What were these things for? What was their purpose in this society?
This is where things get a bit more, open to interpretation. But there are some solid archaeological theories to consider. The main one suggests they were probably pretty important in public spaces, serving different functions. One big idea is that they were used for astronomy. They could have been lined up to track the movements of the sun, moon, stars, maybe even marking things like solstices and equinoxes. Who knows? Maybe these stones were their way of understanding the cosmos.
Like giant stone calendars or something, right? Helping them keep track of the seasons, maybe guide their farming. What else should we be thinking about?
They might have also been used to mark important places within their settlements, like plazas or the homes of important leaders. This links to another theory from archaeologists Francisco Corrales and Isabel Medina Gonzalez. They say the spheres were probably symbols of power and status within these pre-Columbian societies. The bigger the sphere or the more central its location, the higher the status, like a visual way to show power and order.
The bigger the sphere, the bigger the deal. Makes sense.
Right. And the effort it took to make them and move them definitely tells us they were valuable. We've also found smaller spheres in burials, sometimes next to pieces of sculptures. What do you make of that?
It hints that they might have had a deeper meaning, something spiritual or ritualistic beyond just being on display. So there could be this whole other layer of meaning connected to their beliefs about death and the afterlife. Fascinating. And then there's the whole question of how they moved these things. Some of them weigh like 20 tons. Try moving that without any modern machinery. It boggles the
It
mind.
really is incredible, isn't it? The most likely explanation is that they used logs or some kind of basic platform, plus a ton of people working together. The terrain in the Keys Delta is pretty flat, so that would help with dragging or rolling them. But even so, the weight is a huge challenge. It just shows how organized and resourceful they were.
It makes you wonder how they coordinated all that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about some of the more, shall we say, creative theories. Every mystery has those, right? The ones that really capture the imagination. What are some of the less mainstream ideas about these spheres?
Yeah, there are some out there. Some theories link the spheres to Atlantis, that lost civilization. Two anthropologists, Ivar Zapp and George Erickson, they thought maybe the spheres were like ancient navigation tools, maybe pointing towards places like Gibraltar, the pyramids, or even Easter Island. Fun to think about, but there's not much solid evidence to back those ideas up right now.
Right, those are some big claims. What about aliens? It seems like every time we find something ancient and mysterious, someone brings up aliens. Has that come up in your research?
Of course. The idea that, extraterrestrials made these spheres or helped move them, it comes up all the time. But archaeologists aren't buying it. The museum in Costa Rica even goes out of its way to explain how the spheres were probably made, showing that humans were capable of doing this. So for our investigation, we're sticking with earthly explanations.
Sticking with good old human ingenuity, what about the indigenous people themselves? Do their stories and traditions have anything to say about the spheres?
Oh, definitely. The Bribri and Quebecer people, they're believed to be descendants of the cultures that made the spheres. And they have all these fascinating stories. One is that the god of thunder, Tara, used the spheres as cannonballs, firing them from a giant blowpipe to fight off hurricanes. It's a pretty cool image, right? And it tells us something about how they might have seen these objects, their power, their connection to nature.
So maybe they saw them as more than just objects, but as like weapons of the gods or something.
Yeah.
And are there any like local legends or folk tales that you've come across?
Oh, there's one about a potion that could soften rock. Supposedly, this potion made it easier to shape the stones, but from a scientific point of view, it doesn't really hold up. You see, most of the spheres are gabbro, and that's a tough rock, really resistant to acids. A simple potion probably wouldn't do much to it. Limestone, maybe, it can be affected by acids. But since gabbro is so common, it kind of throws a wrench in that potion theory.
Yeah, the magical potion is a fun idea, but
Yeah.
the reality of the rock itself kind of debunks that. Okay, as we wrap up our deep dive, let's talk about the big picture. What's the archaeological significance of these spheres? And if this were an active case, what kind of research would be going on right now?
These spheres are incredibly significant archaeologically speaking. Most researchers agree that they were made sometime between 300 and 1550 CE, mostly by the Dikis culture, and most of them probably date back to after 1000 CE. But figuring out the exact date is tricky because a lot of them were moved from where they were originally. And when you move an artifact, you mess up the context, the layers of soil and stuff that archaeologists use to figure out how old something is.
It's like trying to solve a crime when someone's rearranged all the evidence.
Exactly. That's why the research happening at Finca 6 is so important. The Museo Nacional de Costa Rica, they're digging carefully, documenting everything, trying to find spheres that haven't been moved. They're hoping to find layers that are undisturbed, which can give us more accurate dates and more clues about what the spheres were used for. It's a big collaborative effort using archaeology, conservation techniques, all to make sure these things are around for future researchers to study.
And their importance goes way beyond just science, right? They're pretty famous worldwide.
Oh, yeah. In 2014, UNESCO, they declared the settlements with the spheres a World Heritage Site, which is a big deal. It recognizes their universal cultural value. And they've become a symbol of Costa Rica, part of their national identity. You can even see the spheres in modern Costa Rican art and architecture, which shows how much they still resonate today.
They're woven into the fabric of the country, it sounds like. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, we're left with that central mystery. Despite all the research, all the analysis, we still don't know for sure what these spheres were for, or everything they meant to the people who made them.
And that's part of what makes them so fascinating, right? Think about all the things we've talked about. How big some of them are, how precisely they were made, the possible astronomical connections, how they might have symbolized power, all the myths and stories. What stands out to you? What are you left wondering about the people who created these spheres?
It really does make you think about the ingenuity and complexity of past civilizations, doesn't it? Even something as seemingly simple as a stone sphere can hold these deep secrets.
It challenges us to look at the evidence, to question what we think we know about the past. It's a reminder that archaeology is about more than just digging up artifacts. It's about understanding human stories, human creativity, and the mysteries that connect us to the past. And maybe the real discovery isn't finding the one right answer, but in the journey of exploration, in the things we learn along the way.